The guards at Black Ridge Maximum Security couldn't believe what they were seeing on the intake paperwork. Sarah Kaufman, female, 5 feet 4 inches, 220 pounds, and somehow she was being processed into an all-male facility. "This has got to be a mistake," Officer Rodriguez muttered, looking at the heavy-set woman in her mid-40s shuffling off the van in oversized prison blues. "Paperwork says maximum security, male facility," his partner shrugged. "System glitch. They'll fix it tomorrow." They didn't fix it tomorrow. By day 2, the wolves had caught her scent. The Latin Kings controlled C-Block, and their enforcer, a 6'3" former heavyweight boxer named Mateo, decided to make an example of the fat lady who didn't belong. He cornered her in the corridor during rec time, 8 of his crew blocking both exits. Sarah was carrying her meal tray, moving slowly, breathing heavy like every step was an effort. "Hey, mamacita," Mateo sneered, his gang laughing behind him. "You lost? Kitchen's the other way." Sarah set down her tray carefully. When she looked up, her eyes had changed. The exhausted, defeated expression was gone. What replaced it made Mateo's smile falter. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said in flawless Hebrew-accented English. "Stay with me until the end, because what Sarah does in the next 8 seconds will put 3 men in the infirmary and turn Black Ridge's deadliest gang into her personal security detail. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The chaos at Black Ridge Maximum Security Prison began 3 days earlier in a cramped government office in downtown Chicago. A tired clerk named Jennifer Morrison was working her 3rd consecutive double shift, processing transfer orders between facilities across the Midwest. Her eyes burned from staring at computer screens, and her fingers moved on autopilot across the keyboard. That's when she made the mistake that would change everything. Instead of checking the box marked Female Facility Transfer, her exhausted finger slipped 1 line down. Sarah Kaufman's transfer order was suddenly routed to Black Ridge, a facility that hadn't housed a female inmate in its 47-year history. Nobody caught the error. Not the transport team who picked Sarah up from Cook County Detention, not the intake officers who processed her paperwork, not even Sarah herself, who had been told she was being moved to a medium-security women's facility upstate. The system had spoken, and in the world of corrections, the system was rarely questioned. Sarah had been expecting a quiet transition. At 44 years old and weighing 220 pounds, she looked like countless other women who had fallen through the cracks of the justice system. Her charges were financial fraud and tax evasion, white-collar crimes that typically landed offenders in minimum security camps, where the biggest danger was boredom. But Sarah Kaufman wasn't like countless other women. Beneath the soft exterior and tired eyes lay a past that would make hardened criminals think twice. For 12 years, she had been one of Israel's most effective operatives, trained in Krav Maga, close-quarters combat, and psychological warfare. She had hunted terrorists across 3 continents and survived situations that would break most people. That life ended when she moved to America, married a Chicago businessman, and tried to build something normal. The marriage failed, the business went under, and poor financial decisions led to the charges that landed her behind bars. She had hoped to serve her 18-month sentence quietly and rebuild her life afterward. Instead, she found herself stepping off a transport van into the yard of one of the most violent prisons in the state. The intake process at Black Ridge was designed to strip away dignity and establish the pecking order immediately. Sarah shuffled through the concrete corridors, her chains rattling with each step, while guards processed her paperwork with barely concealed amusement. "Never seen anything like this in 23 years. Officer Martinez chuckled to his colleague while Sarah stood in the processing line. "Administrative error, my ass. Somebody up the chain is having a real good laugh right now." The other guards joined in the joke as word spread through the facility. A woman in a men's maximum security prison was unprecedented, and everyone wanted to see how long she would last. The betting pool started within hours. Some guards gave her a day before she would be begging for protective custody. Others were less optimistic. Sarah said nothing during the entire intake process. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best defense in hostile environments. She answered questions when asked, followed instructions precisely, and kept her expression neutral even as laughter echoed through the corridors. Cell Block C was where they housed her, a decision that would prove problematic for everyone involved. C Block was controlled by the Latin Kings, a prison gang with roots stretching back decades. Their leader was a soft-spoken man named Carlos, who had been inside for 16 years. But their enforcer was Mateo Vasquez, and Mateo had a reputation for violence that kept order through fear. Mateo had earned his stripes on the outside as a heavyweight boxer, winning 12 professional fights before a conviction for aggravated assault ended his career. At 6 feet 3 inches and 240 pounds of pure muscle, he was used to intimidating people with his presence alone. His scarred knuckles told the story of countless fights, both in and out of the ring. When word reached C Block that a woman had been placed among them, Mateo's first reaction was disbelief. Then came amusement, then opportunity. In the twisted hierarchy of prison politics, showing dominance over the weak was essential for maintaining power. A confused, overweight woman represented the perfect target to send a message to anyone who might challenge the Latin King's authority. Sarah's first night was mercifully quiet. Her cellmate was a nervous man named Timothy who was serving time for embezzlement. He spent most of the evening apologizing for the situation and warning her about the various gangs that controlled different sections of the prison. "The Latin Kings run this block," Timothy whispered after lights out. "Their enforcer, Mateo, he's not someone you want to cross. Best thing you can do is keep your head down and hope they transfer you out of here quick." Sarah listened without responding. She had already assessed the layout during her walk to the cell, noting exit points, guard positions, and potential weapons. Old habits died hard, even after years away from operational life. The first confrontation came during breakfast on her second day. Sarah moved through the chow line slowly, her breathing labored, playing up the image of an out-of-shape woman struggling with the physical demands of prison life. Other inmates stared openly, some with curiosity, others with predatory interest. She found an empty table in the corner and began eating mechanically. The food was exactly what she expected from institutional cooking, but she had eaten far worse in safe houses across the Middle East. What concerned her more were the whispered conversations happening around the cafeteria as word of her presence continued to spread. That's when Mateo made his entrance. He moved through the cafeteria like he owned it, his crew following behind him with the swagger of men who had never been seriously challenged. Other inmates quickly moved out of their path, avoiding eye contact and focusing intently on their food. Mateo surveyed his domain before his eyes settled on Sarah. She was exactly what he had expected, soft, scared, and completely out of her element. The perfect target to remind everyone in C Block exactly who was in charge. He approached her table with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment. His crew spread out behind him, blocking potential escape routes and ensuring that everyone in the cafeteria could see what was about to happen. "Well, well, well," Mateo announced, loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Looks like somebody got lost on their way to the women's prison." Sarah continued eating without looking up. She had dealt with bullies before, in contexts far more dangerous than this. The key was reading the situation correctly and responding with exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment. "I'm talking to you, lady," Mateo continued, his voice carrying across the increasingly quiet cafeteria. "When somebody speaks to you in here, you show respect." That's when Sarah finally looked up. For just a moment, Mateo caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that didn't match the rest of her appearance. It was there and gone so quickly that he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But Sarah Kaufman hadn't survived 12 years in Israeli intelligence by allowing herself to be intimidated by prison bullies. The question now was whether Blackridge Maximum Security was ready for what happened when someone tried to corner a former Mossad operative who had nothing left to lose. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Matteo stared into Sarah's eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years behind bars: uncertainty. The woman's gaze held depths that spoke of training, discipline, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of. But Matteo was the enforcer for the most feared gang in Blackridge, and enforcers don't back down from challenges, especially not from some middle-aged woman who probably couldn't run a block without getting winded. "You think you're tough, Mamacita?" Matteo snarled, stepping closer until he was towering over Sarah. "You think those soft hands can stand up to what I got waiting for you?" Sarah's response was barely above a whisper. "I think you should step aside and let me finish my walk." The corridor had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at the far end of the block had noticed something was happening, though they weren't moving to intervene. Not yet. In Blackridge, the unofficial policy was to let inmates sort out their own problems, unless someone was actually dying. Matteo's crew was getting restless. They fed off their leader's energy, and right now that energy was building towards something explosive. One of them, a wiry man with neck tattoos named Spider, stepped forward. "Matteo, you want me to teach this lady some manners?" Spider cracked his knuckles, eager to please his boss and put on a show for anyone watching. But Matteo held up a hand. This was personal now. The woman's calm was eating away at his authority with every second that passed. He needed to end this himself, decisively and brutally. "Nah," Matteo said, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "I got this one." What happened next would be whispered about in every cell block for months to come. Matteo drew back his massive right fist, putting every ounce of his 240 pounds behind a punch designed to shatter the woman's jaw. It was the kind of blow that had dropped men twice Sarah's size, the kind that ended confrontations before they really began. Sarah saw it coming from the moment Matteo's shoulder tensed. 12 years of Krav Maga training had given her an understanding of body mechanics that went beyond conscious thought. The punch was powerful but telegraphed, thrown with emotion instead of technique. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's body moved with fluid precision. Her left hand came up in a gentle arc, deflecting Matteo's punch just enough to send it harmlessly past her head. At the same moment, her right palm struck forward with surgical accuracy, connecting with a nerve cluster just below Matteo's sternum. The technique was called stopping the heart. Applied correctly, it could disrupt breathing and send a man crashing to the ground without causing permanent damage. Applied with full force, it could stop a heart permanently. Sarah held back. Matteo's eyes went wide as the breath exploded from his lungs. His massive frame folded in on itself as he dropped to his knees, gasping like a fish out of water. The meal tray Sarah had been carrying clattered to the concrete floor, spilling its contents across the corridor. The silence was deafening. Spider and the rest of Matteo's crew stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible enforcer, the man who had ruled C-Block through fear and violence for over 5 years, was on his knees in front of a woman who looked like she should be working in a school cafeteria. Sarah looked down at Matteo with something that might have been pity. "I asked you nicely," she said, her voice still calm and controlled. "All I wanted was to finish my walk." Matteo struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. The humiliation burned worse than the pain in his chest. Every eye in the corridor was on him, waiting to see how the enforcer would respond to being humiliated by a middle-aged woman. "You," he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah, "are dead. You hear me, lady? Dead." But even as he made the threat, Matteo knew something had fundamentally changed. The aura of invincibility that had protected him for so long had been shattered in front of everyone. Word would spread through every cell block by evening. The heavyweight boxer had been brought low by a woman old enough to be his mother. Sarah picked up her scattered meal tray and began collecting the spilled food. The inmates in the corridor parted before her like water, their eyes following her every movement. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of fear they had once reserved for Matteo alone. As Sarah walked calmly toward her cell, conversations slowly resumed around the corridor. But they were different now, hushed, careful. The power structure that had governed C-Block for years had been turned upside down in the span of 30 seconds. Matteo and his crew retreated to their usual corner. But the swagger was gone. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, planning their revenge. Because in a place like this, what had happened couldn't be allowed to stand. The woman had embarrassed Matteo in front of everyone, and that meant war. But Sarah had already anticipated this. As she lay on her narrow bunk that evening, she wasn't thinking about the confrontation that had just passed. She was planning for the ones that were coming. Timothy, her cellmate, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Are you insane?" he whispered across the darkness of their cell. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Matteo's going to kill you. Him and his whole crew." Sarah stared up at the ceiling, where a thin shaft of light from the corridor painted geometric patterns on the concrete. She had known this moment would come from the instant she decided to defend herself. The only question was when and how Matteo would make his move. "I know," Sarah said simply. "Aren't you scared? They're going to come for you with everything they've got. Knives, improvised weapons, maybe even get some of the Aryan Brotherhood involved. You can't fight an entire prison." Sarah considered the question carefully. Fear was a natural response to danger, but it was also a choice. You could let it paralyze you, or you could acknowledge it and move forward anyway. "Fear is just information," she said. "It tells you to be prepared, but it doesn't have to control your actions." What Timothy didn't know was that Sarah had already begun implementing protocols she hadn't used in over a decade. During her walk back to the cell, she had mentally cataloged every potential weapon within reach, every possible escape route, every structural weakness in the building's design. More importantly, she had identified the real power structure in Blackridge. Matteo might be the enforcer, but he wasn't the decision-maker. That would be Carlos, the actual leader of the Latin Kings, a man who had survived 16 years in maximum security by being smarter than his enemies, not just stronger. The next morning brought a different kind of tension to C-Block. Word of the corridor incident had spread through the prison's informal communication network faster than wildfire. By breakfast, inmates from other blocks were finding excuses to walk past C-Block, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had dropped Matteo with a single strike. Sarah maintained her routine as if nothing had changed. She shuffled to the cafeteria, got her food, and found a table in the corner. But everything was different now. The predatory stares had been replaced by something else: calculation, respect, and in a few cases, opportunity. 3 different inmates approached her table during the meal, each representing different factions within the prison's complex hierarchy. They spoke in code, offering protection in exchange for services, trying to recruit her for various schemes, testing whether she might be useful to their own agendas. Sarah politely declined all offers. She had learned long ago that in hostile environments, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But as she walked back to her cell, she knew that her quiet time was officially over. That afternoon, during yard time, Carlos finally made his appearance. Unlike Matteo, he moved through the prison with quiet authority rather than swagger. Other inmates showed him respect through subtle gestures, a nod here, a step aside there. This was a man who commanded through intelligence rather than intimidation. He approached Sarah's corner of the yard alone, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice was soft enough that only she could hear. "We need to talk." Only she could hear. "We need to talk." Sarah studied Carlos for a long moment before responding. Unlike his enforcer, This man carried himself with the kind of careful intelligence that had kept him alive in a place designed to break men. She recognized the type from her operational days. Leaders who understood that true power came from information, not violence. "I'm listening," she said quietly. Carlos glanced around the yard, ensuring their conversation remained private. "What happened yesterday with Mateo, that was impressive, but it's also created a problem for both of us." Sarah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. In her experience, the person who talked first usually revealed more than they intended. "See, Mateo's my enforcer, but he's also got pride. Too much pride. Now he's talking about bringing in outside help to settle this score. That means chaos, and chaos is bad for business." The yard around them continued its normal rhythm. Inmates lifted weights, played basketball, conducted their own whispered conversations in shadowy corners. But Sarah could feel the undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before her arrival. "What kind of business?" she asked. Carlos smiled thinly. "The kind that keeps this place running smooth. Guards look the other way, inmates get what they need, everyone stays in their lane. But when pride gets involved, people start making stupid decisions." Sarah understood the dynamic immediately. Carlos ran a carefully balanced ecosystem, and her confrontation with Mateo had disrupted that balance. Now he needed to find a way to restore order without appearing weak. "You want me to apologize to him," she said. "I want you to disappear," Carlos replied bluntly. "Transfer request, protective custody, whatever it takes. Because if you stay here, Mateo's going to keep escalating until somebody ends up dead." Sarah considered his offer. It would be the smart play, the safe play, but something in his tone suggested there was more to this conversation. "And if I don't?" Carlos leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Then you better be ready for what's coming, because Mateo's already reached out to the Aryan Brotherhood, promised them territory in exchange for help dealing with you." The implications hit Sarah immediately. The Aryan Brotherhood was the most violent gang in the prison system, and their involvement would turn a simple dominance dispute into something far more dangerous. "How long do I have?" she asked. "Tomorrow. Maybe tonight if Mateo gets impatient." Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you for the warning." Carlos studied her face, looking for fear or desperation. Instead, he saw the same unsettling calm that had unnerved Mateo. "You're not going to run, are you?" "Running isn't really an option," Sarah replied. "Not anymore." That evening, word spread through C-Block like electricity through water. The Aryan Brotherhood was mobilizing. Their leader, a massive man named Kruger, who had spent 20 years in solitary for killing 3 inmates, had accepted Mateo's offer. The attack would come during the night shift, when fewer guards were on duty and response times were slower. Timothy was beside himself with panic when Sarah returned to their cell. "They're saying Kruger's involved now. Do you know who that is? He's killed more people than cancer. You have to request protective custody. You have to get out of here." Sarah sat on her bunk and began her evening meditation routine, a practice that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her operational career. Timothy's frantic pacing was background noise as she centered herself for what was coming. "Are you even listening to me?" Timothy demanded. "This isn't some street fight. These people will torture you for hours before they kill you." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her cellmate with something approaching sympathy. "Timothy, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "When the lights go out, I want you to get under your bunk and stay there until morning. No matter what you hear, don't come out." Timothy's face went pale. "You're really going to fight them?" "I'm going to do what I have to do." The night shift brought skeleton crews and longer response times. Sarah lay on her bunk, fully clothed, her breathing controlled, her mind running through tactical scenarios. She had identified 17 potential weapons within their cell block, mapped every sight line and choke point, and calculated the most likely approach routes her attackers would use. At 2:17 a.m., the lights went out. Sarah heard the soft scrape of cell doors being manipulated, followed by the whispered communications of men moving through darkness. They were coming from both ends of the corridor, a pincer movement designed to trap her in her cell with no escape route. She slipped out of her bunk silently, her bare feet making no sound on the concrete floor. Timothy was already huddled under his bed, exactly as she had instructed. Sarah moved to the cell door and listened. 6 men, maybe 7, moving with the practiced coordination of predators who had done this before. In 30 seconds, they would reach her cell, and the real violence would begin. But Sarah had spent 12 years hunting people who thought they were the predators. She knew that in any confrontation, the person who struck first usually won, and she knew exactly where to strike. The first attacker appeared at her cell door like a shadow, a shiv gleaming in his hand. Sarah was waiting for him. Her hand shot through the bars, grabbing his wrist and twisting with surgical precision. The weapon clattered to the floor as the man's shoulder dislocated with a wet pop. His scream echoed through the corridor, alerting the others that their surprise attack had failed. But Sarah was already moving, using the injured man's body as a shield. While she reached for the keys on his belt, the cell door swung open just as the second attacker reached it. Sarah drove her elbow into his solar plexus, dropping him gasping to his knees. The third man swung a sock filled with batteries, but Sarah ducked under the blow and swept his legs, sending him crashing into the cell wall. By now, the entire corridor was in chaos. Alarms were beginning to sound in the distance as guards responded to the disturbance. But the remaining attackers were committed to finishing what they had started. Kruger himself appeared at the end of the corridor, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of countless violent encounters. He carried a blade fashioned from a sharpened piece of metal, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a killer who had never met his match. "You're tougher than I expected," he growled, stepping over his fallen comrades. "But everybody bleeds the same." Sarah stood in the doorway of her cell, breathing steady, her eyes locked on his. She had faced worse than Kruger in Damascus safe houses and Beirut back alleys. The principle was always the same: identify the threat, neutralize it with maximum efficiency, move on to the next target. "Last chance," Kruger said, raising his weapon. "You can die quick, or you can die slow." Sarah's response was barely audible above the growing sound of approaching boots. "I can give you the same choice." What happened next lasted less than 15 seconds, but it would be talked about in every prison from California to New York. Kruger lunged forward with surprising speed for his size, his blade cutting through the air where Sarah's throat had been a moment before. But Sarah wasn't there. She had slipped to the side, her movement so fluid it seemed like she had simply vanished. Her counterattack was swift and devastating. Her palm struck Kruger's kidney with enough force to rupture internal organs, while her knee found the nerve cluster in his thigh that would paralyze his leg. The giant dropped like a falling tree, his weapon spinning away into the darkness. Before he could recover, Sarah was behind him, her arm across his throat in a blood choke that would render him unconscious in seconds. "Yield," she whispered in his ear, "or sleep." Kruger had never yielded to anyone in 20 years of prison violence, but as consciousness began to slip away, he made a choice that would save his life and change the entire dynamic of Black Ridge maximum security. "I yield," he gasped. Sarah released the hold immediately, stepping back as guards flooded the corridor with flashlights and riot gear. The scene they found defied explanation. 7 attackers down, most requiring medical attention, and one middle-aged woman standing calmly in the center of it all. "What happened here?" demanded Sergeant Martinez, the same guard who had joked about Sarah during her intake. "Disagreement about sleeping arrangements," Sarah replied, straightening her torn prison uniform. "It got out of hand." Martinez looked around at the destruction, the injured inmates, and the woman standing unharmed in the middle of it all. His experience told him there was much more to this story, but prison politics were complicated. Sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions. "Medical attention for the injured," Martinez ordered his men. "And you," he pointed at Sarah, "solitary confinement." 48 hours. Sarah nodded in acceptance. Solitary was a small price to pay for sending a message that would echo through every cell block in the prison. The overweight woman wasn't just dangerous. She was unstoppable. As guards escorted her away, Sarah caught sight of both Carlos and Mateo, watching from different corners of the corridor. Carlos wore an expression of grudging respect mixed with calculation. Mateo's face showed something she hadn't expected: fear. But the real surprise came the next morning, when word of the corridor incident spread beyond Blackridge's walls. The story traveled through the prison communication network, carried by transferred inmates, visiting family members, and guards who couldn't resist sharing the tale of the middle-aged woman who had single-handedly defeated the Aryan Brotherhood's most feared enforcer. Within hours, Sarah's reputation had grown beyond the confines of C Block. Inmates from every faction in the prison knew her name. Some spoke it with respect, others with curiosity, and more than a few with genuine fear. When Sarah emerged from solitary 48 hours later, Blackridge felt different. Conversations stopped when she passed. Even the guards treated her with a cautious respect that hadn't been there before. The woman who had arrived as a clerical error had become something else entirely. Marcus was waiting in their cell, his face a mixture of relief and amazement. "The whole prison's talking about what you did. Kruger's in the infirmary with internal bleeding. 3 of his guys needed surgery. And Mateo, he's been real quiet since you went into solitary." Sarah settled onto her bunk, grateful for the thin mattress after 2 days on a concrete floor. "How's the mood in C Block?" "Different," Marcus replied. "Carlos put out word that you're under Latin King's protection now. Nobody touches you without going through him first." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Did he ask me first?" "Don't think Carlos asks permission for much of anything. But word is, he respects what you did. Says anyone who can drop Kruger single-handed has earned their place here." It was a pragmatic decision, Sarah realized. Carlos had recognized that she was too dangerous to have as an enemy and too valuable to waste as a neutral party. By extending his protection, he was bringing her into his organization's sphere of influence. But Sarah knew that protection in prison always came with a price. The question was what Carlos would ask for in return, and whether she was prepared to pay it. The answer came that afternoon, when Carlos approached her in the library during her usual reading time. He moved with the same quiet authority she had noticed before, but there was something different in his demeanor now. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a fellow professional. "How are you adjusting to your new status?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Still processing it," Sarah replied honestly. "What exactly does Latin King's protection entail?" Carlos smiled. "Smart question. It means nobody in this prison touches you without my permission. It also means you're part of my organization now, with all the benefits and responsibilities that includes." Sarah closed her book and gave him her full attention. "What kind of responsibilities?" "The kind that match your particular skill set," Carlos said. "I've been running this place for 16 years, but I've never had someone with your background before. Military training, combat experience, tactical thinking. You could be very useful to my operation." What started as a clerical error became the most legendary story in Blackridge's 47-year history. Sarah Kaufman walked into that prison looking like someone's middle-aged aunt who got lost on her way to the grocery store. She walked out 18 months later as the most respected inmate in the entire facility. The guards who had laughed at her paperwork learned never to judge someone by their appearance. Mateo discovered that real strength doesn't come from muscles and intimidation. And the Aryan Brotherhood found out that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. But here's the real lesson from Sarah's story. True power isn't about size or reputation or how loud you can shout. It's about discipline, training, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are when everything falls apart. Sarah didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She simply refused to be anyone's victim. Sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it feels like the worst possible place. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from appearing weak until the moment you choose to reveal who you really are. And sometimes, just sometimes, a clerical error can change everything. Now tell us, have you ever been completely underestimated only to shock everyone when you revealed your true capabilities? Share your story in the comments below. And if this incredible tale moved you, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and share this video because everyone needs to remember that you should never judge someone until you know their whole story.